Jonathan Haslam, thanks so much for joining us on System Update.
Good to see you.
As we're recording this, there is talk of a new round of Russia-Ukraine negotiations in Istanbul. Russia has promised to deliver a memorandum stipulating its main requests for the process towards a long-term peace deal. Ukraine has reportedly submitted its own memorandum that is premised on fundamentally first having a ceasefire. That's Ukraine's main immediate demand. What is your assessment so far of this renewed round of peace talks in Istanbul between Ukraine and Russia?
Well, I don't like to sound pessimistic, but on previous occasions, this has always fallen apart. And the problem is that any meeting between Putin and Trump is predicated on the Ukrainian delegation meeting the Russian delegation. And the trouble is that when they get together, that's where things fall apart. In other words, you do need mediation. They've been at war for too long. The stakes are too high. There are people relying on either side to back them up. The whole thing needs massive decompression. And really, this is the responsibility of the United States and the responsibility of the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, to get a grip on this, which is not at all visible because Mr. Witkoff seems to be the troubleshooter of choice. He does make some sense in the context of the Middle East, but I don't think he makes a great deal of sense in the Moscow context. And the Russians are all about status, so I'm afraid Mr. Witkoff has never really cut it for them. On the other hand, they haven't put themselves forward. They've not put themselves out. So for these reasons, I'm not optimistic.
Well, the Trump administration might say, look, we are putting ourselves out there. In fact, Keith Kellogg, the Trump special envoy on Ukraine, who has been sidelined by Steve Witkoff, but is still engaging in these talks and is promising to show up for the new round of negotiations in Istanbul. He just put out a statement seemingly addressing Russian concerns about NATO. This is what Keith Kellogg said.
So just some of the notes that I took, there is this report that Putin has outlined these conditions for ending the war, including demanding Western leaders pledge in writing that NATO won't expand eastward. Is President Trump willing to make that kind of commitment to Putin that NATO won't expand?
Well, I think it's a fair concern. And we've said that repeatedly. Like we've said that to us, Ukraine coming into NATO is not on the table. And we're not the only country that says that. You know, I can probably give you 4 of the countries in NATO, and it takes 32 of the 32 to allow you to come into NATO. And we've seen other countries saying, no, we're not too sure about that. And that's one of the issues that Russia will bring up. And they're not just talking Ukraine. They're talking the country of Georgia. They're talking Moldova. They're talking, obviously, Ukraine. And we're saying, okay, comprehensively, you know, we can stop the expansion of NATO coming close to your border. That's security concerns for them.
So that's Keith Kellogg, you know, going a lot further than anybody in the Biden administration did. He's saying that Russian concerns about NATO expansion are fair. And he suggests there that the U.S. is willing to take NATO expansion off the table, not only for Ukraine, but other countries as well, including Georgia, which was promised NATO membership alongside Ukraine back fatefully in 2008. So what do you make of that? Keith Kellogg saying that Russian concerns are fair and we're willing to take NATO expansion off the table when it comes to Ukraine and Georgia.
Yeah, this is important. The whole business began because the United States was determined to expand NATO and then put Ukraine in it. So this is crucial. But for how long? I mean, they've made statements in the past, for so many years or for the foreseeable future, or, you know, that won't cut it with the Russians. I mean, I just get the impression that however benign these two intermediaries have been on behalf of the United States, they're not the real deal. I mean, the Russians they want the real deal, and this whole business started, well, it started two ways. It started one way with the Americans insisting on allowing Ukraine into NATO sometime in the future, which is like an indefinite threat hanging over the Russians. The other element, of course, is, Putin decided to go to war over this, which was crazy. And it's a war he cannot win. But it's also a war Ukraine cannot win, and it's certainly a war that NATO Europe cannot win. But it strikes me that the key discussions have to be between the Russians and the Americans, with the Americans talking to Ukrainians and then talking the Ukrainians to bring them in at the right point. So in other words, the commitments, the security commitments the Russians need and demand can only be obtained from the United States. And I just think that President Trump is deluding himself if he thinks they can take a slow course and allow the Ukrainians and the Russians to wreak so much destruction on one another. In the end, they'll be exhausted and come through. The danger is they have to be preemptive, and I cannot understand why Marco Rubio obsesses about China at the moment and obsesses about passports of Chinese students at Harvard when we've got this going on. He's running the National Security Council and the State Department. Does he not have a view on this? If he doesn't, then what exactly is the White House up to?
When you say that Putin can't win the war in Ukraine, I imagine that there are some supporters of Russia who would take issue with that, who'd say, actually, Putin's been restrained in Ukraine. He hasn't sent nearly the force into Ukraine that he could. And of course, Russia does have nuclear weapons. So why, in your view, is it impossible for Russia to win in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, you can win to the point of self-destruction, but you must remember that we don't know. We hear all the noise. We hear the noise from Ukraine. We hear the noise in NATO Europe. We hear the noise in DC endlessly. What noise do you hear inside Russia? Nothing, because they cut us all out. None in the West have any idea how bad things are in Russia. And this is a bleeding wound. The Russian economy is in a terrible state. They're basically turning it into a war economy. You can't feed people on a war economy. It's a disaster for the coming generations. The Russians are short of labor. That's why inflation's so high. I mean, putting young men into the meat grinder is not a solution. The oil price is falling and will continue to fall for the foreseeable future, because I think US is already heading into recession. If there's a crash on the US stock market and there's a crisis in the world economy, the demand for oil will go down even further. I mean, the Russians live off oil and gas. So if you were writing a prospectus for Mr. Putin, however loyal you were, you'd have to say, we cannot continue in this way indefinitely. We need to know at least when there will be an end to the conflict. And you are not winning it. You thought you'd win it in 2 or 3 days, for God's sake. And so, it's both sides are locked in, and the United States is the only country with the power and with the prestige to break the logjam. And it's no good sending others, sending people of I won't say second rate, but they're not the top people. When I see Rubio visit Moscow, then I'll know they're serious. And I think that's how the Russians really view it.
Your characterization of Russia certainly contrasts with what Russia puts out. Russia says it has a strong economy, and supporters of Putin point to the fact that he does seem to enjoy, if we can believe the polls, strong domestic support. I mean, do you think he's in at all a more perilous political position than the Kremlin is willing to acknowledge?
We don't know his political position, but I mean, if U.S. interest rates were put up by the Fed to 21%, what sort of state would the U.S. economy be in? Why, what sort of condition would that be? Just as a starting point. So I think Putin is firmly in the saddle because he's made sure over a period since he took power in 2000, certainly since 2004, the people are too frightened to move against him. So I don't think any hope of that happening is going to alter the situation. It's the economic situation. It's the fact that Russia, in the end, it has to resume a normal rate of growth to keep its population on its feet, basically. And so the economy is the key thing. If Trump wants to impose harder sanctions on Russia, he can do so. But the point is that the West looks like it's in disarray. You have, I would call them lunatics in NATO Europe talking about World War III and arming Germany in the next 5 years. I mean, yeah, Germany doesn't have any nuclear weapons. Britain's got a couple. France has got a couple. The Russians can wipe us all out overnight if we went in that direction. So the trouble is there's no coherence from Washington. There has to be a coherent NATO position. And within that position, as you pointed out at the very beginning, you cannot say that Ukraine will enter NATO. So in other words, you've got to be firm, but on that essential issue, you have to be flexible. And it's no use talking about possibilities of war. The Germans using long-distance rockets or giving them to Ukrainians. I don't know. The key thing with these missiles is not the missiles. Who is targeting them? Are they going to be targeted by the Pentagon? Are they going to be targeted from NATO Europe, from Ramstein or somewhere? If they are, and those missiles go in and start hitting Moscow or wherever, this is going to be war.
And you're referring to the statements recently from German Chancellor Merz, who said that there are no longer any restrictions on the range of weapons supplied to Ukraine, including from us, from the Germans, which suggests that Germany has given or is preparing to give Ukraine long-range Taurus missiles.
Yeah, it might, if it was lunatic enough. I mean, Merz is a complete amateur. He lost the elections. They won't allow the new party on the right to get near power. So they're trying to hold their country together and adopt a warlike pose. And Merz doesn't cut it. He doesn't impress people. God knows what. The standard of statesmanship in Europe is even worse than in the United States and in Russia. So one shouldn't look to Europe to save anybody. What we need is firm action, a thoroughly realist position, and we need presidential commitment. And every week I turn on, or every day I turn on the television, and the White House has committed itself to something else. Now it's committed itself to the Reagan Star Wars umbrella idea, when the US is practically bankrupt in terms of debt. There's a sort of stunning lack of realism in the White House at the moment about the world economy, how you're dealing with foreign powers. The only realism is in domestic policy, which is ruthlessly realistic. Maybe that will help them win the House. Okay, so it may make sense in domestic politics. I mean, no one's going to win the House in the autumn by saving Ukraine. That's the truth of it. So in other words, foreign policy can wait as far as they're concerned. The trouble is the situation in Eastern Europe is not stable, and we can't guarantee, with all this warmongering going on in Europe, that it will remain even stable as the graveyard that Ukraine is at the moment. We can't guarantee that will continue indefinitely. But some people in the White House, I think, believe they can wait it out to the autumn.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.